Okay, so welcome to another deep dive. And today we're going to be looking into something that I'm sure a lot of you out there have at least heard about, if not, gone down the rabbit hole a bit on. But it's the death of Kenneka Jenkins.
Yeah.
Back in 2017. And you sent me this really interesting YouTube video that kind of lays out the timeline and the mysteries surrounding it, the unanswered questions and the various theories. This video is from that chapter. And I think our mission today is to go through and try to understand what are the key events and what are the central questions that still remain unanswered.
Okay.
So I guess just to kind of set the scene for anyone who isn't familiar with this case, this was back on September 8th, 2017. Kenneka, who also went by Kick Martin, went with some friends to a party at the Crown Plaza Chicago O'Hare Hotel. So we're in Rosemont, Illinois. And she went there with her friends and it seemed like, a typical night out with friends, but it took a very dark and really quite baffling turn.
Yeah, it's kind of I think this was one of those cases that really highlights how quickly something seemingly straightforward can become really complex.
Yeah.
Kind of going from a missing person case to just this web of speculation and a lot of genuine concern about what actually happened that night.
Right, and so the central mystery here really is, how did Kenneka end up alone in a hotel freezer?
Right.
Was this a tragic accident?
Yeah.
Or, as a lot of theories online suggest, was there something more to this story? And the source material you gave me really kind of highlights that there are a lot of unanswered questions. And there's a lot of conflicting interpretations of the evidence that's out there. So, how do we even begin to piece together what happened?
Yeah, and I think it's a good place to start with. Is to start with just looking at the initial evening. So looking at the party and when she went missing. According to that chapter video, Kenneka arrived at the hotel around 11 p.m. with friends Mono, Faye, and two others. Another friend, Irene, was already in the hotel room in room 926.
Right.
And, it said that the atmosphere inside the hotel room was, a full-on party. There were a lot of people present. Just to kind of, I think that's a good point to just remember as we're going through this.
Yeah, it really establishes the scene.
Yeah.
It's not like this was just a small gathering.
Right.
This is a large group of people, which inevitably makes things more confusing and, harder to piece together.
Yeah.
Now, one of the things that really stuck out to me was, this video was referencing that around 1:30 in the morning, one of the friends, Irene, posted a Facebook Live video.
Mm-hmm.
And this video has become kind of like a real focal point for a lot of the theories that are out there.
Mm.
Because people claim to hear some really disturbing things in the background of this video. People have claimed to hear things like, we're about to murder somebody, or they're still in there raping her. And even somebody saying, help me. And, the video you shared does a pretty good job of acknowledging those claims, right?
Right.
It's not dismissing those as nothing. But at the same time, there's a healthy bit of skepticism in there, because it's well, when you're looking at audio that's very ambiguous, how much of it is what you're expecting to hear.
Right. And I think it really highlights, how social media plays a role in a lot of these cases. You have this one piece of content that can be interpreted, in a million different ways.
Yeah.
And then those interpretations get spread around really quickly. It really starts to, sometimes overshadow, harder evidence.
Right.
I think it says something about how we as a society react to information on the internet now.
Yeah, especially in such an emotionally charged situation.
Right.
Now, one thing that the video points out too is that, some of the things that people are interpreting as cries for help could just as easily be part of the music that was playing at the party.
Right.
It's not really clear. And also there's another video that surfaces later in the night, taken in a different room.
Okay.
And this video shows Kenneka appearing to be intoxicated, but seemingly okay.
Yeah.
And, that chapter seems to suggest that this potentially debunks, the more nefarious interpretations of that first video.
Right.
Because it's okay, well, whatever was going on in that first video, at some point later, she was still, mobile and not in any, like, obvious distress.
Yeah, and I think that that highlights another really important part of the timeline that we need to kind of think about.
Yeah.
How do these two pieces of video, how do they reconcile?
Yeah.
It seems like, she's mobile, she's not in distress in the second video.
Right.
So it makes you think about, okay, well, what happened between those two videos?
Right, exactly. Now, the official timeline states that Kenneka actually went missing around 3 a.m.
Okay.
And then around 4 a.m., Kenneka's mother, Therese Martin, received a call from her daughter's friends.
Okay.
And they told her that they had lost track of Kenneka at the hotel. And this is where things start to get really, I don't know, a little bit suspicious to me because they had Kenneka's car, which was actually her mother's car, and they had her cell phone.
Hmm.
So it's like, well, if you couldn't find her, why would you leave without her?
Right.
And why would you have her stuff?
That's a good point. Like their actions don't really seem logical if they were, truly concerned about her safety.
Right.
The fact that they had her phone in the car, kind of seems to imply that, they assumed she'd be rejoining them soon.
Right.
But they left without, actually knowing where she was.
Yeah.
So it really raises a lot of questions about, their judgment, their level of concern,
Right.
and even maybe what they knew at that time, or maybe what they assumed.
Right. So the explanation that that they gave to Kenneka's mother was that she disappeared after they briefly left her alone in a hotel hallway to retrieve car keys and her phone from inside the room.
Okay.
And your source really highlights the fact that, like, the reason for them leaving the hotel in the middle of the night is just not clear.
Yeah.
They weren't checking out or anything. They still had the room booked.
Right. And leaving someone who's intoxicated, even for a short period of time, alone in a public place like that, it just seems like there's inherent risk in that.
Yeah.
And the fact that they left the hotel without a clear reason and knowing that she was in that state,
Yeah.
it's really troubling, and it doesn't seem like something, that you would expect responsible friends to do.
Yeah. It doesn't really add up.
Right.
Now, around 5 a.m., so an hour later,
Mhm.
Kenneka's mother arrives at the hotel,
Okay.
completely panicked, understandably. And her immediate instinct was to try and review the security footage,
Yeah.
see if she could get any clues as to where her daughter might have gone. But the hotel staff reportedly told her that they needed a missing person report filed first before they could show her the footage. And your source indicates that this might not actually be standard hotel policy.
Right.
So it's already kind of like, that's a red flag.
Yeah, and you think about, when time is of the essence in a situation like that.
Right.
Every delay can have some pretty serious consequences.
Right.
So it really raises questions about, were the staff properly trained? What were their emergency protocols?
Yeah. And it gets worse, right? Later that day, the hotel staff actually called the police on Kenneka's mother and her family who were at the hotel looking for her.
What?
Yeah. Apparently because they were knocking on doors and asking other guests if they'd seen Kenneka.
Wow.
So it's like, instead of, try to be helpful and assist in the search, the hotel staff are basically like, get out of here. We're calling the cops on you.
Yeah, that's really strange. You would think that, that the hotel staff would do everything they could to help find a missing guest on their property.
Right.
But it seems like their actions were more focused on, managing the situation, maybe protecting their interests, instead of actually finding Kenneka. And, that kind of response really fuels suspicion.
Absolutely.
And makes you question their priorities.
Right. So it wasn't until the following day, September 9th, that the hotel manager finally contacted the police to report Kenneka missing.
Okay.
And it's even mentioned that Kenneka's mother, threatened to come back with a warrant and essentially shut the hotel down if they didn't start cooperating.
Wow.
So, it's really sad to see the level of mistrust there and just the lack of help from the hotel.
Yeah, and I can only imagine the level of frustration that her mother must have been feeling at that time.
Yeah.
It really seems like, there was a complete breakdown in communication.
Yeah.
And maybe a lack of urgency or empathy from the hotel management.
Absolutely. Now, tragically, Late on September 9th, going into September 10th, around 12:48 a.m., Kenneka's body was found.
Okay.
And this was almost 29 hours after she was last seen.
Wow.
And her body was found in a walk-in freezer
Oh my gosh.
located in the hotel kitchen. And the police reports describe her as being frozen solid.
That's just horrible. You know, the fact that she was missing for so long and then the location where she was found,
Yeah.
it's just really disturbing.
Yeah. And so the initial findings from the police indicated that there were no signs of trauma on her body.
Okay.
And the official cause of death was determined to be hypothermia. So basically, her body temperature got so low that she died. Now, the toxicology report is where things get a little bit more complicated.
Okay.
Because it revealed that Kenneka's blood alcohol content was 0.112.
Okay.
So that's above the legal limit for driving in most places. So it was definitely a significant level of intoxication.
Right.
But maybe not like extreme on its own, right?
Right.
But crucially, the report also found that there was topiramate in her system. Now, this is a drug that's often prescribed for things like epilepsy and migraines. And the video you shared really emphasizes that topiramate is known to significantly intensify the effects of alcohol.
So even though, her blood alcohol content wasn't extremely high,
Right.
the combination of that with the topiramate could have made her much more impaired than, what that number suggests.
Right.
It could have affected her judgment, her coordination, her spatial awareness.
Right.
And that might help explain, some of her movements in the hotel later on.
Right, yeah, because it's not just about the amount of alcohol.
Right.
It's about how that alcohol interacted with the medication she was on. Now, one of the other things that was kind of strange is that her clothes were described as being a little all over the place.
Okay.
And this initially led some people to speculate that maybe there was a struggle or an assault. But, that chapter does a good job of explaining that this could also be consistent with what's called paradoxical undressing.
Right.
Which can happen in the later stages of hypothermia where the person starts to feel like they're really hot even though they're actually freezing.
Right.
So they might start taking off their clothes. So, it's important to understand these physiological responses when you're trying to make sense of what happened.
Yeah, absolutely. What might seem suspicious at first glance, could actually be explained by how the body reacts to extreme cold.
Right. Now, let's talk about the surveillance footage because this is really where things get a little bit crazy with the online theories.
Okay.
So there is footage that shows Kenneka walking through the hotel around 12:15 a.m. and she appears to be on her own.
Okay.
So, this is several hours before she's officially reported missing.
Right.
And, it makes you wonder, where was she going? Who was she with? What was her state of mind at this point?
Yeah, it's natural to ask those questions.
Right.
She's outside of the initial party room. It makes you wonder who she interacted with during that time.
Yeah. And then there's later footage from 2:26 a.m. that shows her kind of wandering around and appearing to be unwell.
Okay.
And this is after her friends have supposedly left her in the hallway.
Yeah.
And, the source material kind of points out, why would they leave her alone if she was in that state?
Yeah, it just seems so irresponsible.
Yeah.
If she was in that state, why would they leave her unattended?
Right.
In the hotel hallways? It doesn't make sense.
Right. And this is where a lot of those online theories take hold because people have looked at this footage, this later footage of Kenneka wandering around.
Yeah.
And many people believe that they can see other figures with her, like individuals who are staying out of view of the cameras or even physically guiding her. There's specific claims about a man in a blue jacket and white hoodie and, even a hand trying to grab her. But, your source material, really breaks down those claims and looks at the footage. And the conclusion seems to be that these are just misinterpretations or, pixelation in the video, stuff like that.
Right. And I think this really highlights how difficult it is to interpret grainy surveillance footage.
Yeah.
Our brains are wired to find patterns.
Right.
So when we're looking for something or when we suspect, foul play, we tend to see things that might not actually be there.
Yeah, we're looking for answers.
Right.
So we're going to try to find those answers in ambiguous imagery.
Right. And it's a good reminder to, really rely on verifiable evidence,
Right.
instead of just, speculating based on, unclear visuals.
Right. There's also been this, discussion online about whether the footage was tampered with.
Hmm.
Some people think that maybe the footage was edited or altered in some way.
Yeah.
And your source does mention this because there's like perceived inconsistencies with Kenneka's appearance and her movements in the different clips.
Yeah, and allegations of tampering, they're really serious.
Right.
And they often come up in these cases where there's, a lot of unanswered questions.
Right.
But it's important to remember that without, any concrete evidence, it's just speculation.
Yeah.
And, sometimes, what seems like an anomaly might actually be, just a limitation of the recording technology or just the angle of the camera.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
So, as you can imagine, the internet was and still is kind of like a hotbed for theories
Right.
about what happened to Kenneka. Your source mentions this activist, Andrew Holmes, and he actually viewed the footage before Kenneka's mother,
Okay.
which I thought was interesting in itself. And he went on to state publicly that he didn't see any evidence of Kenneka being forced into the freezer.
Okay.
But, Kenneka's mother, disputed it.
Yeah.
So you've got this kind of like difference of opinion.
Right.
And, it fueled further distrust.
Yeah. Especially when you have someone, who was involved in the investigation, saying one thing,
Right.
and then the victim's own mother, disagreeing with that.
Right.
It just adds to, this search for alternative explanations.
Right. Exactly. And then there were these claims about, maybe there was other footage that hasn't been released
Right.
from the kitchen area where the freezer was.
Mhm.
But the hotel denied these claims and said, no, what you see is what you get. There's no other footage.
Uh-huh.
Which, again, I don't know, it just kind of adds to the mystery.
Yeah. The fact that there's not, complete video coverage of all the areas, that might be relevant.
Right.
It adds to the questions, and it allows for people to speculate.
Right. Now, this whole situation understandably led to protests at the hotel.
Right.
And there's this weird thing that happens where Andrew Holmes, the activist we talked about, reportedly asked Kenneka's mother to help stop the protests.
Really?
Yeah.
Why?
Because the hotel was losing money.
Seriously?
Yeah. He was like, hey, the hotel's losing money. Can you tell the protesters to stop?
Wow.
And, Kenneka's mother understandably found that to be kind of a ridiculous request,
Yeah.
given the circumstances.
Yeah, that just seems so insensitive.
Right.
To prioritize, the economics of the hotel
Mhm.
over, this grieving family's, search for truth and accountability.
Right. It's just weird. Now, despite all of this,
Yeah.
despite calls for like a federal investigation into Kenneka's death, the Rosemont Police Department concluded their investigation, and they said, we found no evidence of physical or sexual assault.
Okay.
The only